Good afternoon and welcome. We're going to resume and begin our final afternoon session, and I am thrilled to have you all with us. I'm sure there's people filing in. I know we had a shorter lunch break than expected, so I will talk for a little bit to get you as you come in. So our current panel, distinguished panel, is called Watched, Tracked, and Distracted. Can we still experience solitude? Much like the opening panel this morning with Wyatt Mason and Ann Lauterbach, where there we had two writers, poet and writers. We here have two artists, two people very involved in the world of art and who have thought deeply about the way art is connected to social change, to politics, to solitude, to corporate business interests. And we've asked them to think very much along the lines of, as Ann Lauterbach was talking about this morning, about the way that technology, surveillance, potential loss of privacy is impacting the practice and activity of practicing artists. So let me introduce the people up next to me. To my left is Carol Becker. Carol is the dean of the faculty and professor of the arts at Columbia University School of Arts. She runs their arts program, their graduate arts program. She is a prolific writer. Has written many books, including The Invisible Drama, Women and the Anxiety of Change, and Thinking in Place. To my far left is the artist Michael Mandiberg. He's an associate professor at the CUNY Graduate Center and the CUNY College of Staten Island. He runs the New York Art Practicum. You may have seen recently in New York the exhibit of his latest project, which was to print and display voluminously in volumes the entirety of Wikipedia. Of course, the entirety didn't fit in the gallery, but you could order it if you'd like. He also, a number of years ago, developed an artwork of sorts that was called Shop Mandiberg, in which he sold his entire life on the web through a web store that he created. You could buy everything about him, and he will be talking about that as well. So both Carol and Michael are going to give a short introductory talk about the work of artists in a technological, watchful, and surveilling age, and then we'll have a discussion. We'll start with Carol. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. So, we're talking about solitude again, and so many people have spoken so eloquently, and so much has been said. So I'm just imagining this as just another layer on the conversations that have been taking place. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, good. So just two comments before I read these very brief opening remarks that I've written. We've been talking a great deal about government and corporations intruding on our privacy, but really not so much on the privacy that we're willingly giving away through social media, nor examining really why we're doing this. So, and to what effect. So that's one query. And then we have been talking about the self, at least in the conversations around solitude and the inner life. So what kind of self do we want to be is a question that it's still out there. It's been raised and still out there. And what kind of self are we evolving into? And how consciously and deliberately are we as the species evolving this self? How consciously are we actually noticing the fact that we are evolving, and there has been a lot of people have said, well, it's just happening, you can't resist it. But if I believe that, I really don't think I'd get up in the morning. I wouldn't resist anything or have any position on anything. So why wouldn't we have a position on where our species is evolving. So the provocation, I guess, for this, my brief remarks here is, can we talk about the evolution of the species? So some time ago, and I should preface this too, I'm going to tell you about a very small little incident that happened to me, but I want you to know that I'm much more sophisticated now, having sat through 2 days of this forum, and probably would have reacted differently, but I'm glad I reacted the way I did because it gave me the opening for my piece, my naivete. So, okay. So some time ago, I should tell you a little story here. Some time ago, I started using the Kindle app on my iPad. This was big for me, to read those big, heavy biographies and novels that I'd been lugging around the world for a long time. I still wasn't reading more philosophical books on it, but nonetheless, I was glad to discover by chance that there was an underline function. And I picked salmon. You have color choices. I picked salmon. I was therefore completely unnerved when, while immersed in and underlining Pico Iyer's book, The Art of Stillness, a readout popped up, and it said something like, "You are the 123rd user to underline this same passage." Shocked by this intrusion, I threw the Kindle onto the bed. And I almost threw it out the window, but those of you who have New York apartments know that there's these kind of windows, you can't really open them very much. Okay, so you get the picture. So a sickening feeling came over me as if the bottom had dropped out of my stomach, and then I became actually afraid. Someone was reading over my shoulder, not a real person, I knew that much, but some program monitor was calculating what I found important in the text. Was I supposed to feel validated by this, to learn that a passage that I underlined so many others also liked? Or was I supposed to feel completely banal? Rather, I was mortified. When I told friends about the Kindle Orwellian incident, as it came to be called in my mind, some were equally horrified, but others were surprised I was upset. Well, just turn off the function, they said to me. But to me, the privacy inherent in the act of reading had been irrevocably violated. I had rarely felt quite so psychically unsettled, except perhaps 40 years before in San Diego when I was running the local lettuce and grape boycott. Some of you will remember this is a long time ago, for the United Farm Workers Union, and my phone was tapped. But at that time, I knew why, who, and what to expect. This was worse because I didn't understand that such a program existed or that anyone would care so specifically what I liked or didn't like about a book. Now, of course, I understand that if they pick out this passage that, hundreds of people like, that would be a great marketing tool, right? But, I was still shocked. Okay. So surveillance in the abstract really has not bothered me much lately, not as it once did. And perhaps I simply have acclimated to the notion that everything we do is findable, knowable, and marketable, except perhaps our deepest thoughts, or so I believed. And this is why the intrusion on my contemplative state of reading affected me so much. Reading is my refuge from the world, and now it too had been invaded. In the 60s and early 70s, we feared the CIA, the FBI's COINTELPRO, and the local authorities, and there was reason. We, many of my generation, had an agenda to change the world, and the government, knew we were subversive to the existing system, not just in our actions, but perhaps more significantly, in our thoughts. But that was then. I read an article recently that conjectured that in the past, we were, quote, private by default and public by effort. It was once difficult to get information about people, and it also was difficult to get information about ourselves out into the world. Now, the article said, we are public by default and private by effort. But how much effort does it take to keep a sense of inviolability? We can be found most anywhere in the world at any time through our own devices, pun intended. The office comes to you, as do all its problems. The intrusion is ubiquitous and it's omnivorous. And most of us are addicted, including me, to these systems of connection. That's what humans do. We get addicted to the things we create. People expect an answer, they expect it now. At times their ability to work depends on it. We have internalized these space-time obligations and don't know how to step away from them. If one does not make a Herculean effort to remain balanced in the face of this imbalance, then one is fragmented and often very unhappy. So for the purposes of this discussion, what would it mean if the need and desire, now in conflict, and also generationally in conflict, for privacy, solitude, time, and focused attention were to disappear from the species altogether? What if we woke up to find ourselves the last humans to be bothered by the intrusion of our privacy? What would it feel like to believe that our species had evolved out of the need for an inner life? I don't mean to sound like what Dana Boyd calls a techno-fretful parent, but perhaps I am. I have a public self as a dean and a private self as a writer. The writer self has a deep need for solitude, or I have a deep need for solitude, which is why I became a writer. And the need for quiet and solitude comes from another deep need, which is the need to think. And thinking requires that one not be intruded on, at least for a time. Thought, as Arendt notes, is essential to understanding our human condition. In order to actualize this task of non-utilitarian thinking and to produce work that tells the stories of human experience, inner and outer, writers, artists, and others need solitude or the illusion of solitude. And they need time. The result of an always-on ethos is that one has neither time nor space within which to lose oneself in reflection. There is always something outside the self, robbing the self of the self. When the famous monk Thomas Merton, author of Seven Storey Mountain, took a vow of silence, it was very unexpected. Not long before, he had been the editor of the Columbia University undergraduate humor magazine. Merton's vow to leave the world and to become a Trappist was not because he did not love the world. In fact, he might have loved the world too much, but because he needed to develop his spiritual life. The choice was not to move away from the world, but rather to move towards himself. If as a species we have come to spend our time projecting ourselves into the world and not developing ourselves to ourselves, are we then not living completely in the spectacle that Guy Debord describes? The spectacle, he writes, is not a collection of images. Rather, it is a social relationship between people that is mediated by images. And for Debord, what is dangerous to society is that passive identification with the spectacle supplants genuine activity. It creates an inverted relationship to reality in which the projection of the self and the addiction to this projection is more real and significant to everyone than actual human interaction that might actually lead to change in society. What could better describe our contemporary situation than to say that all has become simulacra and the public sphere is no longer a place for collective action, or very rarely, but rather a place primarily redesigned to publicize the self, to make the self visible to ourselves and to others. Arendt wrote, "It seems to be in the nature of the relationship between the public and the private realms that the final stage of the disappearance of the public realm should be accompanied by the threatened liquidation of the private realm as well. Perhaps we have over-adapted to being watched and to the poverty of time, with little left that is not posted, shared, projected out into the world to be liked or ignored. At what point does our humanness, as we have known it and as we have theorized it, become unrecognizable to us, or has this already occurred?" In The Human Condition, Arendt wrote that were humans ever to leave this planet to go to another where the contingencies of life were all man-made, then everything we have theorized about our humanness on this earth, our adaptation to natural conditions and to our physical relationships to each other, would cease to make sense. Yet, she writes, quote, "Even these hypothetical wanderers from the earth would still be human, but the only statement we could make regarding their nature is that they are conditioned beings, even though their condition is now self-made to a considerable degree." So to end, I often feel we might already have deplaneted to that bionic virtual world, even though gravity and the body still binds us to this one. Many are pleased to imagine living outside nature as we've known it. There are phrases now like debodying the brain, uploading the brain, and the intimacy of our physical selves. So debodying the brain and uploading the brain and the intimacy of our physical selves might help us escape the anxiety of mortality, the weight of individuality, and the obligations of human personal and societal interaction. So enamored as we are with this constant projection of the self outside itself, what then could it mean to talk about the evolution of the species? That's my provocation. Thank you.
before. That's too high. Before I begin, that's maybe a little too high still. I'm not an expert in microphones. I usually just talk loud. Before I begin, I'd like to point everyone to a project by Silvio LaRusso and Sebastian Schmieg. It's called Networked Optimization, in which they researched for a number of very popular books on Amazon. They researched which were those phrases that were most highlighted, and then created a series of books that only had the highlighted phrases. It's a really interesting kind of collective intelligence or lack of intelligence. So I'm coming here as an artist and as a sometimes writer and thoughtful person. But I think that what I'm bringing to this conversation is a practice. And I want to talk about ultimately labor. Labor and solitude. So I'm going to start by talking about dogs. When I walk my dog taps his nose on my calf. He does this, dogs do this, to remind you that they are still there. Moreover, the gesture is mutually self-constituting. Oh, we are not getting projection. No, we are. I just forgot that I had a black slide. I'm sorry. I just want to give you some context. For those of you that don't know, this is an image of a work by An Kawara, who's an artist, and he sent over about 2 or 3 decades, he sent about 900 telegrams to people that said the same thing, I am alive. He sent postcards with the time at which he woke up. There's a whole theme of sort of oeuvre of work in that vein. This gesture of my dog tapping his knee reconstructs our relationship each time anew. You are big dog, I am little dog. I am still here, we are still here. Dog trainers call this checking in. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work I did between 2001 and 2004. That it may be easier to understand these as performances. My work comes from a background of conceptual art. I work in a variety of different media. The idea comes first, and then I find the right form for it. This work involves performance, it involves websites, it involves photography, it involves writing. I'm going to go through these somewhat briefly so we can talk about them later. In 2001, on a project called Shop Mandiberg, as Roger already said, I put all my possessions up for sale. I photographed them like as if they were objects for sale, and wrote text describing them as if it was a catalog. And there's a variety of goals, but the one that I want to sort of put out here is to think about what, I was trying to think through what this kind of objectification of the self through these kinds of props which one buys meant for subjectivity. Am I my props? Am I more than my props? In what ways am I dependent on these things in order to perform? What happens when someone else takes them? What goes with them? It sold about a third of my, about 500 items. It's all up there if you'd like to look at it. I offered my food for sale, didn't sell any. That was one disappointment. What's that? That was sold? Yes. There are a number of things that were irreplaceable that were sold, sentimental objects.
What about your computer?
My computer was sold. which made it very difficult to maintain the project. Eventually, I had to go out and get a new computer. There's a lot of things that the project made me do, interestingly. I followed that up a year later with a project called The Essential Guide to Performing Michael Mandiberg. It was a extensive do-it-yourself guide to performing myself as a character, thinking less about objects and more about actions and behaviors and thought processes. These are some information, some basic statistics. It's important to note this is all also up there. I'm a different person now, which is also interesting. This is how I usually sat at the time. I think that might be somewhat similar, but somewhat different. I had to describe all my friends, so I'll explain why I had to in a second. Just took photographs and described a variety of my friends. This was made for a project called the Exchange Program, where I worked with 7 other artists and arranged exchanges between them. We each performed each other's lives for a period of time. So I went to Toronto and performed the life of a woman named Amy Satterthwaite. She left for me some written materials and Post-it notes all over her house. This is not you. We each made videos. This is her video. This is my video. Those are actually before video was really easy to put up online, so they're not actually up online in full. And then lastly, I did a project called In Network with Julia Steinmetz. These slides are actually out of order. I'm going to go to this one first. I had moved to New York in 2004 to take a position at CUNY, and she was still in LA. We were partners at the time. And we had switched to a cell phone plan that allowed us to make unlimited calls. This was very common at that time if you were in network. Unlimited text messages and photo messages. Photo messages were quite new at that moment in network. And we had taken to just spending hours on the phone. We would eat dinner together on the phone as we were separated. And there was this kind of telepresence and tele-intimacy. So at some point I was like, well, what happens when can we document this in a way that is resonant and poetic of this kind of condition that we're living in? So we created a blog, which was also new at the time, and photo blogs and things like that. Routed all the cell phones, all the text messages through there, all the photographs, and also made podcasts of all of our conversations. My favorite was also 2 times we did a night-long performance where we slept on the phone together. I'm going backwards so you just can see the other ones. So I don't make artwork in isolation. I make work from and in and with a public. I do not work alone. I share a studio. I work with a team of assistants and collaborators that can be as small as 2 and as large as 10. Some work gets done in person with other people. Others are far away. I'm not a mythic, modernist, solitary genius, alone in the dark. My entire life has been mediated by electronic networks. I have lived far from the rest of my family, communicating with them via a range of networks. I applied for my first jobs, adult jobs, via email, found my apartments, places of living, my oikos, through networks, electronic networks. I made my first post-collegiate artwork, the shop Mandiberg, which I told you, by uploading web pages to a server. And just a note for the students that are in the room, I was 6 months out of graduating when I made that. The work you're doing is real. And in that moment, I discovered an art community on mailing lists, on message boards, I met lovers via avatars and algorithms. I eventually meet many of these people IRL, in real life. This last weekend, I met someone who I had been regularly talking to for over 15 years. I'd never met him in person before. There had been a number of close calls. We exclaimed at our encounter. We shook hands in that long way that really should be described as holding hands. We held each other's shoulders. I'm actually here. We're both actually here. We've been here the whole time. We will be here. The networks that these relationships were built on are not the networks on which they live now. Those networks were direct, they were mailing lists, they're email. Now they're alienated. An algorithm sits between me and them. Sometimes I win, and the algorithm decides to show my post to them. Most of the time, I do not. I don't write the correct kind of clickbait. I don't use the right keywords. I refuse to do the work I'm expected to do. This is work. I refuse to do the work I'm expected to do. There's a saying that's been bounced around on the internet so much nobody actually knows who said it, to the best of my research. If you aren't paying for the product, you are the product. This refers to all of the free services, free as in beer, not free as in speech, for those of you who might know what that means. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't have brought that up, actually. Just erase that for those of you that don't. That was out of line. What it means is that on Facebook, you're not paying for it. You're not paying for the product. You are the product. You're being sold to other people. And most of the time we think about this in terms of advertising, right? You're the person, the user, the eyeballs that those ads are being sold against, right? The ads are being sold against you. That's the language that's used in industry. And we think about this. So there's some artists that have come up with a campaign called Wages for Facebook. There's a lot of people who talk about the labor that we're doing there in terms of advertisements, and we should get a share of the advertisements. The reality is that Facebook and Google are worth what they're worth, not because they're ad revenue, although they make plenty of money for ad revenue. They're worth what they're worth because of what they know about you. And we heard Ashkan talk about this yesterday. They're worth what they're worth because they can triangulate it to you. They're worth an order of magnitude more than they should be worth just off of their revenue. If you aren't paying for the product, you are the product. Additionally, in terms of work, if Marx were here to look at these things that we keep in our pockets, he would have some things to say. He would say, those factories you keep in your pocket make so much surplus value, create so much surplus value for the capitalist. What that means, of course, is that these extend our workday. We talked about these in the first session, right? How many of you, I'll just say, I'll go first. During this conference, I have checked my phone for a variety of reasons. I even had my computer out. I did that because I had my employer bothering me. I did that because the thing buzzed because there was something about social networks. I posted something on social networks. And also, I think importantly, I regularly and repeatedly looked things up that I didn't know. And I think that's an important factor that people don't remember about the way these things work when they're up here as instructors or people who are trying to convey information, is that sometimes we say things like, when I said free as in beer, someone might have looked that one up. So just show hands. Of the people in the room, who have used a device in the last 2 days? Right? We're all guilty. Or should we be guilty? But here's the thing. What matters to me is that this is a speed up. That's the biggest issue for me, is the speed up. The work that we're doing. We're doing more work. We're doing work all the time. I'm still in public, but I'm doing work. And this is important for me because, this is important for me because, as I said before, so much of what I do is in collaboration. Now, I'm going to talk about that actually. Let me skip that for a second. Let me just go to points of departure. I want to offer a few points of departure, some questions, some pieces of information that I think will hopefully lead to a nice conversation. One of which is, as Carol's already mentioned, Dana Boyd's meditations on what it means to be always on. And I think what's one of the interesting things that she points to is signaling presence. There's a sort of often a difference between some people who go onto instant messaging or Facebook to accomplish a transactional task, and others who go on simply to mark that they are there. I am still here. I am alive. Yeah. One of the other problems is the rise of the personal brand. Oh, there we go. The rise of the personal brand, which again, Carol mentioned, which is, I think, a distinct function of neoliberalism, where we are all in a market economy and we have to sell ourselves as contingent labor, freelancers. There's FOMO, which, for those of you who don't have FOMO, means fear of missing out. There's so much going on all the time that you're paralyzed, or you want to try to do everything. You're in a relationship with someone, but there's an endless supply of potential relationships you could be in, or friendships, which is psychically debilitating. Along with that is the addiction, right? The internet and these devices and the lights turning on and the buzzing scientifically has been shown to release dopamine in the same way that cocaine does. Analytics control your behavior to make you buy things that you don't want. But more than buy things, there was a Facebook experiment where they try to control the mood of Facebook, right? It's more than just buy things. It's about controlling sentiment, controlling beliefs. I want to hold up Wikipedia as a potential interesting case study of radical transparency, where you can see the history of every edit to every page. Everyone can see this edit, but yet everything is pseudonymous. So there's a certain kind of privacy that is still veiled. I want to ask what the difference between social media is and a society through media, and whether they are or not related. And lastly, I want to ask about labor. And I come to this as an artist, not as an Arendt scholar or expert. And I've learned a lot in the last 2 days. But one of the questions that I have is, where does the work that I do as an artist in my studio that is not the making fit in? I spend so much of my time writing emails, updating my webpage, posting to social, writing grant proposals, writing more grant proposals, going to teach at CUNY, which is my job, so that I can have the time in my studio. And I don't know, maybe I spend 30 minutes a week in that space, that flow, that making. It's really gotten quite tight. What is the difference? So Arendt has 3 categories of labor, work, and action. And my understanding is that Arendt puts art making as work that is unalienated. And the artwork becomes part of the action. But what about all the work I do that is not the direct making? Because this is one of the conditions of making art, I think, in this context. So I'm going to leave it with that.
We have about 20 minutes, so we're going to try and move quickly. And I want to let some of you ask questions. So I'm going to just ask each of them one question and then open it up. Carol, for you, you talk about the self that we want to be, and then you somewhat darkly talk about the self we may be evolving into. A self with little solitude, little time, as over-adapted to being watched. And I'm wondering, I know, and in many ways, Michael described himself as someone who is a networked self, maybe becoming an algorithmic self, but also trying to resist it. And yet, Michael also, said that he's trying to make people think and trying to find a space for thinking. So I'm wondering, when you hear Michael talk, is he describing the kind of self you worry we're evolving into? Or are you hearing him as the self that, we're evolving into, but he's also found ways to make it not so worrisome?
Well, Michael's transitional. He's has lots going on in many layers and levels going on. But I thought FOMO, that you brought up FOMO, I never knew what that was, but all the young people in my office talk about it, fear of missing out. And that's because of this enormous overstimulation, this sense that the world is infinite and possibilities are infinite, and people are really having a really difficult time landing. And some of that's really happening in personal relationships. I hear this all the time. So there's this notion, there's just another website. Maybe I could meet someone on that website. And, there's so many people out there. Why would I land on this person? And the result of just that one element is that people are lonely and cannot create a social structure for their life, even though they're still desirous of some of the things that my generation wanted. And I think that humans, we want a companion in life or companions in life. So, but that's what I mean by transitional. I think we still want the things that the body wants, but part of us, I think, part of the species, I think, is actually trying to leave the body, because the body is this messy entity which feels pain and sorrow and grief and longing and gets sick and gets old. And there's just so much of this projection into this future world where these elements won't exist because so I think underneath it, and that's what I was trying to say, is I think there's the most human of all fears, which is fear of our own death and fear of leaving this life. So what is projecting, I'm trying to get at what is motivating all of this distraction, because that's really what we're talking about, and Michael's talking about, and we all know how difficult it is to keep this attention. Even in the business world, they're talking about mindfulness, Thich Nhat Hanh, Buddhism, because it's a desperate need to find a way to have a core self or core parts of the self that can actually stay centered. And we're talking about solitude. The reason we're even using that word is because sometimes, and Anne was so articulate about it this morning, sometimes we have to recalibrate. She was talking about receptivity, but we have to actually recalibrate ourselves because we're so projected out that we're lonely for ourselves. And we have to pull these projections back in and get centered so we can go back out. So I think Michael's aware of all these things, so I don't want to make him a case study. But as an artist, I think his point also is very well taken, which is the romance that I think Arendt and others have had. And I love Hannah Arendt, an artist, I have to say. But because she lived when she lived and because she didn't understand the market as it exists now, I think she truly did believe that artists could live in this unalienated zone. But the truth is that the work is a commodity living in capitalism, and that one has to be an entrepreneur as well as a maker and a thinker and a feeler and all the things that one needs to do to make that work. So those are just parts of how I think about it. But it's this real soup of complexity that I think we have to just deconstruct it. We have to take it apart and look at it because we're all living in it right now and we're all feeling it.
And what I really want to ask Michael, thank you, Carol, is do you feel transitional? And I guess I'll ask that. I mean, I thought it was, I loved this distinction you made between when I did it, it was direct network. But for other people doing it, their algorithms are interfering, and it takes work to overcome that. And I guess I want to know what, to a certain, I guess I want to know, are you, in a sense, feeling transitional? Are you feeling that the new generation, the networked with algorithm, is missing something, just like Carol's saying that some networked generations were missing something? Is that, I mean, is this the generational change happening so fast and speeding up so much that everyone's feeling transitional?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone feels transitional, sure. In that sense, like, I also think that this idea of a digital native is a kind of fictive and very narrow vision of things. I don't think that, there's a scholar out of Chicago who I'm blanking on her name, but she's done some incredible social science research on digital literacy and found that in fact so-called digital natives actually don't know so much about what's actually happening. So it's a very fictive idea. I think we're all transitioning in that regard. In terms of the difference between the direct network and the algorithm, I think that there's a shift that happens, and I think maybe you can look at the difference between, say, Twitter and Facebook, where Twitter is all just one news feed. It's one fire hose. It's called the big pipe, right? Like the full flow of everything. And so it's just flowing. And on Facebook, so that's like almost just like a form of direct popularity. And on Facebook, it becomes more about things that you do. So things that tend to show up more frequently in your Facebook feed. Happy things, unless they're deaths. Deaths seem to show up, right? It's a place for mourning. Marriages, like my Facebook feed is constantly full of marriages and engagements and births and all kinds of other heteronormative and homo-nationalist actions. I don't do those things. So when I post, it's not what Facebook wants. Now, why is it not what Facebook wants? Because it's not what people click on. It's not what advertisers want to sell ads against. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it works for me, but most of the time it doesn't. And so there's that sense of being cut off, not from so much a public as being cut off from a sense of community.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of the algorithm and Facebook, in a sense, training you to post the way it will be successful, reminds me of what Carol said about the Kindle. And I mean, and it's not just the marketers, but as Michael said, I mean, this is going to be used to train the editors, who are going to then train the writers to write this way. And we can only imagine.
Already happening.
And it's already happening. I'm gonna throw it up open for some questions, so we can at least bring some people in. I see one in the middle there. Can you stand up and get a mic? Someone have a mic?
Fear of missing out. I want to, just a few observations. Fear of missing out, I experience as a generational thing. I'm 63. I no longer have fear of missing out because I consider myself beyond the pale of relevance. And it's a great relief to be released from concern about how the culture is doing and what's my role in it. I have my niche. I develop my niche. And so, I just wanted to also observe that, you know, I remember as a kid, first time seeing jets go overhead, from propeller planes to jets. And we'd always look up and watch the jet. On some levels, what we're talking about here is simply a transition from propeller planes to jets. I remember about 10 years ago reading in Harper's Magazine how I'll ask a question, I promise, how the how the car marketers knew where to set up the Subaru dealership and where to set up the Ford dealership, because they knew where everyone was and lived among themselves. So I'm really wondering if we're making much ado out of simply the streamlining of technology, and if the answer isn't more about cultivating an ethos and an ethic as an alternative rather than hitting these inevitable changes head on. For example, there is such a thing as a Sabbath that one could embrace. I wonder if our job as older people and as students and all the rest is not to really actively cultivate the private, the alternative, to what can't be stopped.
All right. So either of you want to much ado about nothing?
I'll just briefly say that I have taken to leaving my computer at my studio on weekends. I have been taking a Sabbath.
You know, one of the great joys of my life is being a dean of an art school and being around always the next generation. And what's wonderful about that is that no one has failed yet, you know, in art school. Like, there's always this enormous potential and possibility. And I want for my students who are really so deep and so thoughtful to feel in their lives that they can, that place that they go to, that creative place, is validated, and to understand what it takes to stay in that place consistently so that they can produce the work that we all need from the next creative generation. To me, this is a very serious matter, to allow that cultivation of the self, and my fear that we are evolving out of the understanding of the importance of that. So for me, it's not just the move from one technology to another, it's the move away from everything I have understood as at the core of what makes us human.
Yeah, I just want to say that as a teacher and as parents, which are similar, our job is not to tell students or children what they should do. They will develop that on their own. They will create new worlds. Our job is, to the extent we can, to tell them what is and what has been. That's where our expertise lies. Certainly my expertise is not what's coming. I'm not a prophet. And so I don't speak of doom or glory. I think our attempt is to try and tell them what is. Hannah Arendt says that education is both conservative, telling people what has been and what is, and revolutionary, telling the kids, you go figure it out after that. And I think that's very much, as you know, the older people, that's what our attitude can be. See a question in the back there. Yeah, you stand up. Yes, and let me just say, there are plenty of seats down here at the bottom. I see people sort of standing and sitting uncomfortably. Please come down towards the bottom, and you can sit down.
Right. So my question is to Michael, but anyone that's on stage can answer it. I was wondering what you thought about Facebook. If you recall, in the beginning, they had their status updates say, is, and then you would write something, and it turned into what are you thinking, and now it's what's on your mind. What do you make of that? And the curious thing that you can do where you click on who you share it with, and you can say only me. And what do you think that means in terms of what you said about the reaffirmation of the self? And you know,
I'd never thought about that you can share it only with you. That is really profound, right? Right. Why are you not just writing that in your journal? Why are you giving that? Why are you giving that to Facebook to then run analytics about you?
Well, my thought was that when you share only me, what you're reaffirming yourself by precisely that. The advertisers that know who you are reaffirm who you are through, you know.
I really like that speculation. I'm now thinking this through, and from a more instrumental point of view, my guess is what that is it allows somebody to hide something.
Right.
That was once public, that they might want to make public again. which
makes sense.
maybe also points to this fluidity about what is public and what is private, and the way that is an effort to try to make things public and then make them unpublic. When the reality is, once it's public, because the internet never forgets.
Of course. So it's the illusion of privacy.
We have a question down here in the third row in the green.
It seems like a lot of the issues we're talking about here are just the limitation of Facebook and the algorithms and big data to redefine ourselves sort of aptly. And I was thinking about how language gives us that same ability to redefine ourselves through the module of words. And I wonder if maybe if the problems in Facebook and big data is just a computational problem. And maybe in the future we will be able to redefine ourselves with better computations in a way even more succinctly than language.
Okay. Either of you want to?
You don't want to touch that one? Or do you? What are you shaking your head about?
I just don't know how to touch that one. So you go
I'll
for
try it. So one of the things about the presence of data and big data, as it's being called, although Kate Crawford yesterday problematized that notion, is that it is beyond what we can see. Somebody today, and I'm blanking on who actually, talked about the flowers. And you spoke about flowers and being able to find the one flower in this giant field, right? And that's kind of what we're questioning, is that it becomes about computer vision, and we rely on this externality, but the externality can only see in certain ways. And I think what you're asking is, can we get to a point where that becomes more precise? Yes, it will be more precise, but we will never actually be seeing flowers. We'll only be seeing patterns of flowers. We'll only be seeing the anomalies. So I think that's one of the other considerations. Like and then it becomes about homogenization and anomaly.
I wanted to say something quickly because it reminded me of something I wanted to say to Anne this morning, but I couldn't say it, which was when you said something about you got frustrated with your mind because there was certain kind of knowledge that you couldn't remember dates, or you couldn't put dates together with a situation, or that you needed a context. And I was thinking that just to go from that to one of the struggles of the university, which is that I think that what we don't validate enough is the metaphoric mind, which is the poetic mind, and that we each have a unique kind of mind, but there's this value put on this quantifiable kind of mind, and this is also what's happening in the universities, which is this love affair with the whole notion of big data, personalized medicine. I mean, resources going there because I think that because it's very difficult to articulate the importance of that symbolic metaphoric mind for what we can understand and reflect back about ourselves and the society. So I wanted to say that to you earlier. I just got a chance to. You reminded me. One more question or no?
Take one last question. Right, Sam, stand up, Sam. And please keep it brief. We need to move on soon.
So, Michael, you talked about, I think you brought up something that hasn't really been brought up over the course of the conference, and that is intimacy, which I think is what Hannah Arendt is referring to when she talks about the realm of privacy as the space of love. And you talked about how you use social media to connect with people, and you talked about the friend you talked to for 15 years, but then the handshake and the holding, and that what happened in past between you, or you talked about finding lovers, but you didn't talk about what happened with those lovers. And so it makes me question whether or not we're talking about social life or private life, and whether or not, where do we draw the lines of privacy? Are we actually talking about privacy here? Or are we talking about those things that we're willing at some level to objectify, or that have some sort of exchange value?
Let me just try to understand that question, because I'm trying to figure out where the question is, and I'm trying to figure out, but can I just ask it back at you? You're asking me whether what we put up on a social network is what we're willing to part with that has exchange value.
Exactly, and I'm not, I mean, how are you thinking about privacy? Because, you will sell the objects of your life, but what about your memories? What about what you hold most dear to you? What about the real private space of the self, that space of solitude?
So in that regard, I think part of what that project was about was trying to take chunks of things, right? Categories of things, or things that fit into a structure, and then play with them. So in that regard, like, things left when those objects left. I changed through that process. It did change me. No, I couldn't sell, I don't know, can the market bear memories? Like, can you exchange memories on a market, right? That's a really interesting question. But I think that for me, the goal was to take one thing and see what happens with it. It was an experiment in a way. When I launched the thing, I was just like, I hope somebody buys something. Just make this not worth my while, right? But it in turn changed me.
All right. Please join me in thanking Carol and Michael.